The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the chest and makes every sound feel louder than it should. Ethan sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, the stench of iron and mildew clinging to the walls. His mind raced through the events that had brought him here, each detail like a jagged shard cutting deeper into his thoughts. He wasn't supposed to be here. He hadn't done anything. Yet the world had turned against him with frightening precision, as though someone had laid the trap years before he ever stepped into it. It started with a deal he hadn't even been part of. A warehouse robbery, drugs, and a dead man, words that sounded like poison whenever the prosecutor spat them at him. But Ethan had never touched drugs in his life, never seen that warehouse, and the dead man had been a stranger. Still, the evidence had stacked up neatly, almost too neatly. His fingerprints on the gun, his jacket found at the scene, his phone records conveniently placing him near the crime. It had been impossible to argue with such clarity, even though he knew it was all fabricated. The trial was a blur. His lawyer, a tired man with more cases than hours in a day, barely raised his voice in defense. Witnesses, paid liars, swore they'd seen him that night. And when the judge banged the gavel and declared him guilty, Ethan felt the world collapse in on itself. 5 years. 5 years for something he hadn't done. The first year in prison hardened him. The fear burned away, replaced by a quiet rage that simmered just beneath his skin. He replayed every detail of his arrest, every word spoken in court, until the truth began to take shape like a shadow sharpening under the moonlight. Someone had set him up. Someone who had wanted him out of the way. And as he thought back to his life before it all, his job at the firm, his sharp rise through the ranks, the envy in his coworkers' eyes, he knew exactly who it was. Marcus Hale. His colleague, once his friend. They had started together, working late nights, sharing secrets about ambition and dreams. But Ethan had always been better, sharper, more trusted. And Marcus had always been the one watching from the corner, smiling too easily, asking too many questions. Ethan remembered now the way Marcus had nudged him into meetings, encouraged him to take cases that brought him closer to powerful clients. Marcus had been setting the stage, laying out the path so when the fall came, Ethan would take the hit. Years dragged by. Ethan kept his head down, never spoke of revenge aloud, but inside, he built it brick by brick. He taught himself patience, learned to read people better than ever before, and when he wasn't studying faces, he studied the law books that lined the prison library. He read every word about evidence, corruption, loopholes. By the time his release date came, Ethan wasn't just a broken man seeking freedom, he was a blade sharpened by suffering. When the gates opened and the cold air of the outside world hit his face, Ethan didn't waste a second. He walked out not as an ex-convict, but as a man with a mission. His first step was quiet observation. Marcus was thriving, just as Ethan suspected. He had taken Ethan's clients, Ethan's position, even Ethan's old office. His face was all over the business journals, smiling the same insincere smile Ethan remembered from years ago. The world saw him as a successful man. Ethan saw him for what he truly was, a thief and a betrayer. Ethan didn't confront him, not yet. Revenge, he knew, wasn't about anger, it was about precision. He started small, collecting information, digging into Marcus's dealings. And what he found was gold. Behind the polished reputation, Marcus's empire was rotting. He had dipped into illegal contracts, bribed officials, even laundered money through offshore accounts. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone determined enough to pull the threads loose. Ethan became a ghost in Marcus's life. Anonymous tips to journalists. Whispers to federal investigators. Files left in the right hands. Each move was calculated, each strike carefully timed so Marcus wouldn't see it coming. Slowly, the walls began to close around him. First, the rumors spread. Then the audits began. Then the arrests of his closest associates. Marcus's smile grew tighter with every passing week. Finally, when the empire was crumbling, Ethan stepped out of the shadows. He met Marcus one evening in the parking garage of the firm that had once been theirs. Marcus's face was pale, his expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes frantic as he looked around and spotted Ethan leaning against a car. For a moment, he didn't believe it was him. The man he had buried years ago, the man he had destroyed. "You," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "Me," Ethan said calmly. Marcus tried to recover, to sneer, to demand what Ethan wanted. But Ethan didn't need to raise his voice. He just told the truth. That he had known all along. That he had waited. That Marcus's downfall was no accident. It was justice served by the very man he tried to erase. By the time the authorities swarmed in and dragged Marcus away in handcuffs, Ethan didn't feel the rush of triumph he had once imagined. What he felt was deeper, quieter. Freedom. The weight that had pressed on his chest for years was gone. The world finally saw the truth, and though the scars of prison would never leave him, he had taken back what was stolen, his name, his dignity, and his life. And as he walked away from the chaos, the sirens echoing behind him, Ethan realized something else. Revenge hadn't just changed Marcus's life, it had changed his own. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that cell years ago. He had been broken, rebuilt, and forged into something stronger. He had been framed for a crime he didn't commit. But in the end, his revenge had rewritten everything. Ethan didn't sleep much in those first nights after his release. The world outside felt foreign, almost hostile. The noise of the city was sharper than he remembered, the lights brighter, the people moving too quickly. Freedom was supposed to feel like a blessing, but after years behind bars, it felt almost like another kind of prison, an open one. But he had purpose now, and purpose kept him steady. He found a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place no one would look for him. The floor creaked, the wallpaper peeled, and the air smelled faintly of mold, but it was his. He spent hours in silence, laying out documents, scribbling connections on scraps of paper, building a web that pointed to one name over and over, Marcus Hale. Marcus wasn't just thriving, he was untouchable. The newspapers called him the Golden Man of Finance. Politicians smiled beside him at fundraisers, charities praised his philanthropy, and television hosts welcomed him as a symbol of success. Ethan watched those interviews in the glow of his cheap television, and every word burned into him like fire. But then there were the cracks. Marcus had grown arrogant in Ethan's absence. He had stretched too far, made deals with dangerous men who weren't as easily fooled as the public. Ethan saw it all, traced it through shell companies, secret accounts, and quiet partnerships. He wasn't alone in this game anymore. Marcus had enemies. Ethan just needed to become their ally. He reached out carefully, never using his real name. He met with people in dim cafes, dark corners of bars, late at night in parking lots where headlights cast long shadows. Men and women who had lost money, lost trust, lost family because of Marcus's greed. Ethan became the voice they had been waiting for, the one who connected the dots, who knew exactly where Marcus was vulnerable. Weeks turned into months. Every night, Ethan became more of a phantom in Marcus's world. Files leaked to reporters. Anonymous recordings appeared online. Hidden accounts were exposed. And with every revelation, Marcus's smile on the magazine covers grew thinner. But Ethan knew revenge wasn't complete with just exposure. Marcus had taken something from him that couldn't be measured in money or headlines. Years of his life. For that, there had to be something more personal. The opportunity came one stormy evening. Marcus was scheduled to give a speech at a charity gala, the kind of event that usually earned him applause and glowing write-ups. But this time, Ethan was there, hidden among the staff, dressed in a borrowed jacket and bow tie. The rain pounded against the glass windows as Marcus took the stage, his voice confident, his gestures smooth. And then the lights cut out. A screen behind Marcus flickered on, and for the first time, the public saw the man behind the mask. Bank statements, contracts, hidden camera footage, all of it played in cruel detail. Gasps filled the room, then whispers, then shouts. Marcus froze, his hands trembling at the podium as his empire collapsed before his very eyes. The authorities were already waiting outside. By the time the lights came back on, Marcus was being dragged away, his protests drowned by the noise of cameras and reporters. Ethan didn't stay to watch the end. He slipped out into the storm, his face hidden beneath the rain. He had seen enough. But revenge has a way of leaving echoes. Even with Marcus gone, Ethan felt the weight of what had been done. People looked at him differently now, those who knew his story. Some saw him as a victim who had clawed his way back, others as a man who had gone too far. And in quiet moments, when the rain tapped against his window at night, Ethan wondered what it had all cost him. He no longer trusted easily. He no longer dreamed the way he once had. His life had been reshaped by betrayal and revenge, and though he was free, he carried the scars of it in his very soul. Still, there was one truth he held onto when the nights grew too heavy. He hadn't let them break him. Marcus had taken 5 years, but Ethan had taken everything from Marcus. And in that balance, maybe, just maybe, there was justice. Ethan didn't expect company in his exile, but fate had other plans. One night, while combing through more financial records in the dim glow of his desk lamp, he heard a knock at the door. He froze. No one ever came here. He wasn't supposed to be found. Cautiously, he opened it, and there stood Claire Donovan, a journalist whose articles had begun to chip away at Marcus's reputation. She looked tired, rain clinging to her hair, her eyes sharp but weary. "You're the one sending me the files," she said without hesitation. Ethan didn't answer, but she stepped inside anyway, her voice low and urgent. "I don't know who you are, but I know this. Marcus Hale is falling apart, and whoever you are, you know how to bring him down. I want in." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost: trust. He studied her, weighing whether she was a risk or an ally. In the end, he decided she was both. And he needed both. Together, they worked in silence and secrecy. Claire's press connections amplified Ethan's quiet sabotage, and Ethan's meticulous evidence gave her the ammunition for her articles. Slowly, the world began to see Marcus not as a golden businessman, but as a predator cloaked in wealth. But Marcus wasn't stupid. He had built his empire on manipulation, and he wasn't going to fall without a fight. Soon Ethan noticed men following him. Unmarked cars idling at corners. A shadow in the reflection of a shop window. Marcus had unleashed his own wolves, the kind of men who didn't ask questions, only demanded silence. One evening, Ethan returned home to find his apartment door ajar. Inside, everything was torn apart, papers scattered, drawers ripped out, his web of strings and notes shredded into nothing. On the cracked wall, written in red spray paint, was a single word: enough. He knew then that Marcus had realized who was behind the curtain. The game was no longer about secrecy. It was open war. Claire wanted him to go to the authorities directly, but Ethan laughed bitterly. "You think they'll listen to me? A convicted felon? Marcus owns half of them already." Instead, he went deeper. He followed the money trails Marcus thought he'd buried, tracing them to violent cartels and corrupt politicians. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. Marcus wasn't just a thief, he was a linchpin. His fall would unravel more than his empire. It would tear open the underbelly of the city itself. And so Ethan's revenge grew larger. It was no longer just about Marcus. It was about exposing everything Marcus had built, the entire rotten structure. The final move came with a risk Ethan couldn't ignore. He planned a meeting with Marcus himself, face to face, after years of shadows. Claire thought he was insane, but Ethan knew Marcus's weakness: pride. If invited to a private confrontation, Marcus wouldn't resist. He couldn't. They met in an abandoned train yard, the city's skyline glowing faintly in the distance. Marcus arrived flanked by 2 bodyguards, his once flawless suit wrinkled, his face drawn with weeks of stress. He looked less like a king and more like a desperate man clinging to a throne that was already burning. "You ruined me," Marcus hissed as he stepped forward, dismissing his guards with a flick of his hand. "I gave you everything, Ethan. And you destroyed it." Ethan's laugh was hollow. "You didn't give me anything. You stole from me. You stole my life." Marcus's voice cracked into a snarl. "You think this is over? You think you've won? I'll rebuild it all." Men like me, we don't die. We multiply. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm, almost cold.
No.
Men like you fall. And when they fall, they drag everything with them. That's the point. From the shadows, headlights snapped on. Federal agents swarmed the yard, guns drawn, shouts echoing against the steel. Claire had leaked Marcus's location, along with the last files Ethan had uncovered. Marcus's empire had finally caught up to him. As Marcus was dragged to the ground, thrashing and screaming, his eyes locked on Ethan's. There was no plea, no regret, only hatred. Hatred that Ethan would carry with him forever. Ethan didn't stay to watch the cuffs snap shut. He walked away into the night, the sounds of Marcus's rage fading behind him. For the city, Marcus's arrest was a headline. For the victims he had destroyed, it was justice. But for Ethan, it was something more complicated. He had won, but victory tasted strange. Revenge had given him back his name, his dignity, but it hadn't erased the years stolen from him. It hadn't quieted the nights he spent staring at prison walls, dreaming of freedom. Yet when he looked at the skyline, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had proven one truth, that no matter how perfectly a man thinks he's buried his sins, there is always someone willing to dig them up. Ethan had been framed for a crime he didn't commit. He had been broken, humiliated, cast aside. But in the end, his revenge hadn't just changed Marcus's life. It had changed everything.